Hello and welcome to Why the Long Face Shortcuts.
These are the choice cuts from season 1 that didn't quite stretch to a full episode.
And this is the first of our shortcuts, examining the link between depression and creativity.
And it's a goodie. Some questions, some thoughts, because I mean the fundamental is what is creativity? What does it mean? How would you define it? Making stuff up?
Well, Bernard Berenson defined creative genius as the capacity for productive reasoning against one's training. Thinking outside the box, basically.
Right. Who's he then?
He was just some guy.
Yeah. Just you got a name like Bernard Berenson, you think you know it all, don't you? 'Cause it sounds like a clever name. Like my name sounds a bit mundane, doesn't it? So people don't listen to what I have to say. But Berenson.
But it's having a bright idea, isn't it? It could be in any field. It could
Right.
be in science, could be in arts, could be in business.
Right.
The guy who finds the gap in the market, I guess.
So is it anything to do? Okay, so creativity may be seeing the world in a slightly different way to other people, and therefore coming up with something that they wouldn't have come up with.
Yeah.
Makes you slightly different from the crowd. Is that anything to do with it?
Yeah.
Aha.
Therefore, that sort of implies that depression might give you a slight edge in the way that you think about the world. That's one way of explaining the link between creativity and depression.
Yeah.
That's assuming there is. I mean, there hasn't been a lot of systematic study on it, has there?
No, I mean we struggled to find studies on this.
I did notice that there had been a study by Felix Post, who was an emeritus physician at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital and Maudsley Hospital in London, both psychiatric hospitals.
Where you have worked, of course.
And in 1996, he published a paper which suggested that depression might be linked to creative genius. And that particular paper was looking at the 100 great writers, British and American writers, and he made retrospective diagnoses of depression in a high proportion of
dangerous but fun.
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult thing to investigate, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there was, but he thought that 50 of the 100 writers had some either depressive neurosis or had a depressive reaction to loss, or I think he said 16 having had severely disabling depressions. Oh, he'd also found actually that there was a 30 times higher risk of depression in poets, in great poets. So it was obviously an interest of his. But he thought that the link was there because creative work itself led to depression.
Rather than a depressive being a creative, it was the other way around, in that if you tried to be creative, the act of creation was something that could, I don't know, cause disruption in the brain, which caused depressive thinking. Is that the sort of mechanism he's talking about?
Post describes creative labours as highly intensive intellectual and emotional work involving vivid mental imagery and inner struggle, and that work over time would cause too much activity in neural networks. But it's just a theory, and I mean.
Wait a minute. Sorry, hang on. 1 second on that. And he's another one with one of those smart sounding names. Is he saying that creative thought leads to patterns that lead to depression? Or is he saying that creative thought is so hard that if you do too much of it, you might get exhausted, anxious, and depressed? Is that which one of those two is he saying? Because they sound like a mishmash of the two to me. Which do you think it is?
Well, I think he's more going along the lines of Aristotle, when he suggested that people were likely to develop melancholia when pursuing intellectual endeavours, the actual work of it.
Wow, because it's so profoundly difficult and strain on the brain. Because one thing I've thought of is the strain of performing. Maybe a stand-up comedian, they're the classic, the Tears of a Clown kind of concept. I would have thought the act of performing stand-up comedy, say, you're on your own, you're probably doing your own material, thousands of people laughing at you, the thrill must be enormous, but the strain must be absolutely incredible. And is there anything to do with the fact that performing and creativity, particularly the performing arts, the stress and the strain of actually performing night after night and trying to get a laugh or trying to induce some kind of audience reaction in drama is so stressful that it's likely to... And we're sort of doing chicken and egg kind of debate here, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. I read something that John Lloyd had written about...
the BBC producer of Blackadder?
He produced, a famous comedy producer. Yeah, he's produced... Blackadder is quite a famous one in the UK, and QI. And he was of the opinion that it was just the case that people with depression, often bipolar though, he thought that people were often bipolar.
Right.
So but they'd need both poles really, but there'd be to be really to see the world differently enough to be that creative and that funny and that inventive. So that's the more positive spin on it, I think. If you think that, well, no, you need to sort of, your depression, it has some downsides, but the upside is that you could be
it sort of goes
creative.
back to what you said at the very beginning about the nature of creativity, and what leapt out to me was that you were talking about sort of seeing the world in slightly different way from the rest of us. It's a little bit like when a new musical genre comes out and you think, what is this?
Yeah.
I remember when I heard hip hop for the first time, and I thought, this is just, the guy's not singing. What's happening here? And I suppose that wasn't one person, that was a movement. Although the Sugar Hill Gang might disagree, but it was so new as to be almost unacceptable, and then it became part of popular culture. And maybe it is that the act of doing something creative is the act of doing something that no one else has considered doing. That's a very similar mechanism to have a brain that goes off in highly imaginative and almost manic, to use old language ways, and there's a downside to that. Is that there's a depressive side to it.
There's another argument, which is that when you come out of depression, that makes you appreciate the world more. It's a bit, you may well also be a bit more resilient and a bit have a bit more sort of strength to see you through a creative project. But the idea that honeymoon period that I often saw in patients when they came out of their depression,
really?
they felt much more energized and much more engaged with life, and we're taking time to stand and stare at things and appreciate everyday things again in perhaps in a more intense way. You can see that would be a springboard into a creative project, that kind of feeling.
Right. So let me play that back. What I think you said was, depressed person, horrible suffering, the world is colourless, the life is colourless, and there's no appreciation of anything. To come out of that, you sort of see normal things, like the wind in the trees and the classic sunset, and even as much as seeing your son or daughter playing in the park or whatever. That even normality suddenly takes on a quality of wonder. Yeah, and in that state, it's not a big leap of logic to say that person might become quite creative, positive, etc.
Gives you a wider perspective, more positive way of looking at the world. But an awareness of the dark side as well. I suppose a greater so that in a work of fiction, you can imagine that would be really useful to have that
insight,
that intense awareness of the positive and very negative aspects of existence.
It's again chicken and egg, isn't it, the conversation that we're having? Because in that you say a depressive episode might lead to creativity, and we've also had the Aristotelian, that sounds really clever, Aristotelian theory that the actual act of creativity can lead to depression if you're not too careful. Don't you think about those existential problems too hard, Aristotle would say to his nephew, you'll make yourself ill.
Yeah, so there's two opposing views. They might both be true, but not at the same time.
I get you.
Right, but there is a third way, like a Tony Blair third way here, which is
Blair, get over it, he's gone.
Bambi's gone. Messed up a bit though, didn't he? Made a few errors.
Natural segue into the Iraq War.
There's a third possibility, which is the one that Anthony Storr favours. He was a quite prolific writer, actually, Anthony Storr, in the area of psychotherapy. And he talked about the depressive, someone who has low confidence in themselves, for whatever reason, has some self-esteem issues, manages to correct those somehow through their work. But those features of low self-esteem may also predispose them to depression. So the third explanation is you have a personality makeup that predisposes you both to being creative and being depressed. And he talked about this thing called psychological unease. So you have a degree of psychological unease in order to want to change things.
And that was something that could cause great creativity because you're trying to resolve that in yourself. Hence the stand-up who does lots of self-depreciating humour and everyone laughs and validates him in some way.
Right. So that's in some way undoing the low self-esteem. Yeah.
All the way through to becoming depressed.
Right.
So that's the third way. That's the Blair way. So in summary then, some people think the act of creativity can make you depressed. Some people think that being depressed can make you creative. And some people think you can have a personality disorder, which could give you both.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think possibly all three are true at different times in different people. But I do like this idea that reawakening after a period of depression is going to give you a much more insightful view of life and of the human condition, which actually is what all art is about, isn't it? A better understanding of the human condition.
So a question for you then, who's let's say, and when my son was very little, he used to ask what Uncle Paul did for a living, and I told him Uncle Paul makes people happy, which he was very pleased about. And so all the people that you've made happy, or eased their depression, cured their depression, how many do you think, I don't know if you've asked them the question, how many do you think see their depression as something that, not they're glad they had, because no one would be glad to have suffered that kind of misery, but something that they would rather keep within their life, not constantly, obviously.
Well,
but are they quite glad that they've been through it, because it's given them insights that they otherwise wouldn't have had about life?
Well, I do recall that when my book first came out about 10 years ago, which was sort of implying some positive aspects to having gone through the experience of depression, I did get quite a lot of emails from people saying, "You're right. Yeah. I went through that, and it wasn't pleasant, but I came out the other end, having changed my career, changed my direction, with a new set of goals, and perhaps a little bit more awareness of my strengths and weaknesses, and in a way more resilience." Do you want to say anything about the stand-up comedians, sad clowns?
Yeah, well, I love stand-up comedy, as you know. I've seen a lot of it in my time, and I think all things that we've talked about could relate to stand-up comedy. The stress of doing stand-up comedy in quality night after night must be unbearable, and I'm not at all.
Well, you've done it, right?
Well, yeah, I don't like to talk about it. Like you don't like to talk about your book every other hour.
No, you don't like to talk about it? No, of course you love talking about it.
I'm trying to be coy.
Right, yeah.
I did try.
You do on the London circuit, very successful compere.
I was a reasonably mediocrely successful compere, but I enjoyed it a lot. But it was unbearably stressful sometimes.
Yeah.
When you didn't feel like it, and you had to get up there and you had to be creative. If you were a compere, you had to be spontaneous. It was very, very stressful, and I can see. But I can also see the other theory that you talked about, in that someone with a depressive mind, almost as Aristotle would say to his nephew, "You think too much." Also helps you come up with situations which are a bit crazy, a bit quirky, a bit difficult to explain, which leads to humour, and people recognise, oh yeah, that's ridiculous. Yeah, I'd never thought of that before. But you're right. Yeah, people do that. That's hilarious, and you can see the mechanisms.
And that's because you're digging into that deep well of despair when you were depressed. You can dig into that.
Yeah. Potentially. I did speak to one stand-up comedian once, and I was talking about this. And he said, no, I'm not depressed, not interesting enough. And it was a joke. But there was some sort of almost. I really envy these depressed comedians, because it makes them really interesting and come up with good material in what he said. But his delivery was exceptional.
Yeah, I mean, there was a survey about stand-up comedians done at Oxford University, January 2014. Of all the people that responded to their survey, over 500 comedians, I think, they scored high on depression and introversion. Well, they were personality tests, they weren't diagnostic tests. But they also scored quite high on extroversion. So they were extroverted introverts.
That sounds ridiculous, but I've spoken to a lot of comedians just after they've come off stage. Even fairly famous ones, the TV panelist type level of comedian. And if you say, even to the ones that have that persona on stage of being very cocky, arrogant, big mouth, and you say to them, wow, that you killed it, you really crushed that one, that was a great 20 minutes. Almost without exception, they're incredibly humble and grateful. And you sort of see that vulnerable side, which you can almost imagine them, I hope I'm not reading too much into it, that they're thinking, yeah, validated, I'm okay. Even the people, who were higher up the comedic rankings than I was, and there were many, would have that relief in their eyes, and you wonder whether that is something to do with their psychology.
So everyone assumes that every stand-up comedian is a depressive or has had depression. What's your experience? I know you're supposed to be asking the question.
No, that's fine. What of depression?
Did you suspect that a lot of them were depressive? Miserable.
I do sometimes. There was often a melancholy about the stand-up comedians I came in contact. I think I wasn't imagining it, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think sometimes the comic, the clown, sometimes wonders what their place in society is. If you think of
Right.
medieval times, when you'd have the jester, was a bit of a pathetic figure who would get his head sliced off by the king if he wasn't funny, and his comedy was a bit infantile and ringing a bell and stuff, and you were sort of the clown, you're a servant almost. And you wonder whether people, particularly as they get into their 30s, 40s, 50s, it's no longer fun, because doing stand-up in your 20s is a huge laugh, because you get drunk after and you meet people, etc.
Yeah.
But as you go older, you might start to question, what the hell am I doing? I'm doing knob gags and I'm 50. I'm getting laughs from people in their 20s. Really? Right. Is this it?
So you're saying there might you're going down the road of it's the work that makes you depressed rather than the depression that feeds the work,
which is quite neat circular thing. That's right.
Or maybe it does both. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Which again was the third way.
Hey, thanks for joining us on Why the Long Face. As ever, we're here to inform, hopefully, and entertain, but we're not here to give you medical advice. There is, however, information on our website, whytlf.com, that's whytlf.com, about where to get help. See you next time.